He teaches Greek and Latin at all levels, as well as a course in translation on topics such as Greek mythology, introductory Greek history and culture, and the invention of difference in the ancient world. Please join me again in welcoming Professor Cioffi.
So thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me if I do this with my mouth? Should I?
Yes.
Can I use the microphone? No. Okay. Can you guys hear me in the back a little bit? All right. So I'm delighted to be here and to talk to you guys. I live on campus. I'm in the Bard Houses program, and I see you guys come, and it's really exciting to see you, and it's even more exciting to talk to you. I will not really lecture you a lot. I'm going to ask you questions and make you talk because I'm out of practice talking. No, that's a joke. But yes, I tell other jokes. Okay. But I will make you talk. So I want to talk to you today. I've called this from papyrus to paperback. Do you guys know what a paperback is? Do you know what a papyrus is? Excellent. Okay. My job is done.
Not everyone knows.
Not everyone. That's good. We'll cover this. Let me just sort of frame my topic a little more broadly. I will get to the papyri very soon. I love papyri, but in fact there are papyrus plants out there. You'll be able to identify them at the end of this talk. But I want to frame what I'm doing a little bit more broadly and maybe a little bit more conceptually. And really what I want to ask you guys about and think about with you today is how we get from the present to the past and what we gain from this journey. I teach classics, which I'll talk to you about in a second, is basically reading really old books today. And I think it sometimes seems really self-evident that you can just pick up a book at a bookstore. And so what I really want to do is re-mystify the ancient world. Which is to say that reading things that are 2,000, 2,500, 4,000 years old is really amazing. And I want to talk to you about how that happens and what it means that these texts survive and what gets lost in the process, if that makes sense. So I think the world of classics seems really dusty sometimes to people, and my point actually is it's a miracle every time you pick up a text of the Antigone. I guess you guys have been reading the Antigone, is that right?
Not yet.
Not yet, but you will. Okay, excellent. So I want to start actually not with classics, but with this image from the summer. Does anyone recognize this image?
From the new James Webb telescope.
It's new from the new James Webb telescope. Excellent. Can you tell me a little bit about what we're seeing? I don't mean to put you on the spot.
We are seeing the most in-depth picture of the universe ever, and the way that travels that picture is showing those stars and galaxies from 4.6 billion years ago, the beginning of the Big Bang.
Yes, and so to just repeat so everyone heard that, so we're seeing the oldest, most in-depth picture of the universe, and the reason that we can see this is that light takes time to move, right? And so 4.6 billion years ago, a really long ways ago, I'm not going to do a lot of science, you should talk to a real scientist for this. This happened, and it took 4.6 billion years for this light to get here. This is so far away from us. It's kind of extraordinary. And what I think it tells us, which I'm just going to sort of use as a framing point, is that to look further into the past, we have to look away from ourselves in a fundamental way. One of the extraordinary paradoxes of this is that to see into the past, we have to move geographically further and further and further away from us. And I think that this is really important to think about when you're thinking about reading things from the past. If you pick up the Antigone, and you will, if you pick up a book that is really old, you're moving not only through time, but you're also moving in all kinds of different distances. And in fact, it is impossible to look so far back into the past, at least in physical terms, without moving away from yourself. And so that's sort of partly what I'm going to try to do, is sort of move these texts a little bit away from our modern sort of context. And the basic point I'm going to make is that one way that we can do this is through light, right, the telescope, but another way we can do this is through the process of writing, if that makes sense. And so the kind of basic thesis of this talk is that writing in books are a technology of memory and also of time travel, if that makes sense. If you just do a brief thought experiment, I won't make you answer this, but think of the oldest story you know that someone has told you. Think about a family story. Think about a story that someone has told you about a legend of Bard College, of a place that you grew up. And think about how old that story is. And think about sort of how it's possible to get beyond that story. And what we're trying to do here is get beyond that story. And the thing that allows us to do that in many, many, many cases is either a space telescope or a book. And a multi-billion-dollar space telescope and a book do something quite similar. So far, so good? Okay, excellent. So let me just briefly tell you about what classical studies is, and then we'll sort of get into some things. And I think that's worth doing just because I don't claim to know about all of the past, and in fact, I don't really claim to know about much of history. After like 400 CE, I'm really, really vague. So like think 1600 years ago, that's my cutoff. But classical studies, which I teach in, is the study of this basic area here. I've made it quite big. And maybe this is sort of like a more reasonable sort of map. People often think about classics as being about Latin and Greek, about Greece and Rome, but in fact, there's this enormous world of the Mediterranean of people who lived between 2,000 and 2,500 years ago, roughly, who were doing all kinds of things, sometimes together, sometimes apart. And my interest is about reading the literature that these people wrote and understanding what they did. And so this is the kind of particular time travel. You might notice some places that don't traditionally look like classics in a bookstore. So, for instance, Egypt, the Levant, right, which is where we see now Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. These are all parts of the ancient world, and they were incredibly productive and active parts of the ancient world. What we think of as now Turkey was an incredible center of culture and learning that was at least as connected to the Greek world as Athens itself was. So this is just again to kind of like demystify a little bit what we're doing, and also to make a very brief plug. If you want to read any of these languages, these are some of the languages that were taught. In the fall of 2022, we can teach you Greek and Latin. My Egyptian is not very good, but one day, perhaps. And then we'll just talk a little bit about time. So today is August 11th, 2022. Can someone give me like an old book? I'm not sure it's going to be on my slide. Yes?
Gilgamesh.
Gilgamesh, excellent. Gilgamesh is way, way back. It's not on my slide, but it's like there-ish. Another old book. Yes?
Dracula.
Dracula. How old is Dracula?
No idea.
It's about 100-ish years old, I think. 1850s. So it's like way, way over here. Another old book.
The Bible?
The Bible. That one is super, super, super hard, but I'll just like stand here-ish. It gets very, very controversial very, very quickly. Another old book. You guys picked none of the books that I chose. I chose some
The
very...
Odyssey.
The Odyssey, also really, really hard, but I'll stand over here, if that makes sense. I'm just trying to give you a kind of general sort of span. So I chose Don Quixote. No one here thought of Don Quixote as an old book? I guess not. When Marina Van Walen comes, who will talk to you about boredom, on the back of her car, there's a bumper sticker which says, "What would Don Quixote do?" I guess he would not come to this lecture. Okay. Where do you think Sophocles' Antigone fits in that picture? Yeah, you're pushing me this way. Should I stand here? More this way?
Keep going. Everyone see. That's more than 5 minutes.
Right here. Exactly. Oh, hold on, there it goes. Sorry. So about 500 BC, just to give you a sense of the time span, what is that little dividing line, just so we know?
0.
The non-existent 0, the birth of Jesus Christ, right? So this is Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. This is before Christ, and then people decided that that was too Judeo-Christian, so now it's called the Common Era and before the Common Era. You might notice that they're the same eras, they just have different names. And then finally, to just give you a little bit of perspective, if we want to be as far from the birth of Christ as we are today, we have to go basically to Egyptian texts. And so one of the earliest Egyptian texts is the story of a shipwrecked sailor, which is basically one of the earliest narratives that we have preserved in writing. And it sounds as it does. It's about a guy who gets shipwrecked, and he sort of like goes and he travels and he encounters like a mystical crocodile, and then he goes home. So this is just like a really brief introduction to the kind of world that I'm in and the kind of world that I hope to introduce you guys to. And now I hope we'll do a little bit of work together. So I want to start a little bit by thinking about classics as a mode of translation and as what translation means and to sort of rethink what that is. You guys have been talking a little bit about translation a tiny bit. Does someone want to tell me what they think translation is? There's no wrong answer here. How would someone define or tell me what you think we mean when we talk about translation?
Interpretation in a different language.
Interpretation in a different language. What do you mean by interpretation? Sorry, you answered my question and now I put you on the spot. That's very cool.
Well, you have to do some type of interpretation because languages have evolved so much, especially in longer time scales.
Excellent. So one thing that translation does is it involves this process of like interpreting, right? Like you can't, like when you put something into a translator, it's not that you get a precise replica in a different language of what someone said. If someone transcribed what this was and they put it into like ancient Greek, they would have to make a series of choices about what I meant, because ancient Greek words don't correspond one-to-one to modern words. Excellent. What else? I saw a hand. Anything else? Does everything that is interpretation count as translation? You're shaking your head. So is there some other kind of basic feature of translation that you think needs to be there? Yes?
I think it makes an idea accessible to people who it was not originally accessible.
Interesting. And so, again, are there limits on that, right? Like, say, for instance, I told you about the shipwrecked sailor story, right? Does that count as an active translation? That's a question for you and for everyone. You are nodding.
I think that when we all disagreed that translation was not all interpretations were translation, I disagree with that. I think that all interpretations are translation.
Excellent. And so can you say a tiny bit more?
Sorry, go ahead.
Can you just say a tiny bit more about that?
I can try.
Excellent.
I think that anytime you take something and you put it into different words, I think we're taking the word translation a little bit too literally. I think this class wants us to like see beyond the box of translation, the literal translation. And I'm trying to challenge myself to see that.
Excellent. So in a sense, what you're sort of saying, right, is that if you guys go to Google Translate, which do you guys know what Google Translate is? For those of us who teach ancient languages or any languages, it's the bane of our existence because you think we do not need to know languages, but you do. So if you go to Google Translate and you type something into Google Translate, it spits something out in another language, right? If that makes sense. So if you, I have to read a lot of German as a class, since German is a really hard language, my German is really bad. I like type some German into Google Translate and it tells me like roughly what it means, but it sounds like a computer generated it. What you guys are saying is that's not all the translation is, right? Translation is not just like converting words from one language into another, but it's about kind of translating, or I shouldn't use that word, it's about carrying across ideas and concepts and experiences from one kind of set of cultures, languages, and signs to another. And in fact, that is like very close to what the etymological meaning of translation is. So if you guys were to take Latin, sorry, this is also secretly a plug for taking Latin and Greek, you would come to know these words. One is this word which means tron, which in Latin means across, and the other is this word, basically latio, which means to carry. And so the original notion of translation that the sort of word encompasses in the history of its roots is the idea of carrying one thing across to something else, which is precisely the kind of way in which you guys have described translation here. If you were to ask an ancient author, by the way, just as a sort of footnote, and they were to describe translation, they might use that word, but they might use some other concepts. So sometimes they describe it as theft, which is actually sort of an extraordinary language. Sometimes they describe it simply as interpretation. And sometimes they describe it actually as hermeneutics, which is another word for interpretation. So what we're trying to do here is to sort of, or what I'm trying to do here is to think a little bit about like what translation means in the context of the ancient world, and to suggest how much actually gets translated. So I hope this will be, well, we'll get to some objects in a second. And let me just start with the Antigone, which you guys are about to read. So this is like the edition that you guys will have. What can you tell me about this book from the cover, if that makes sense? I guess you guys have not yet read it. I miscalculated when I would come in your experiences. Can you tell me, like, who wrote it? Sophocles? How did you figure out that it was Sophocles?
Sorry, no.
Because you already know? What does it say? Like the big blue jaggedy box? Sophocles with the Roman numeral 1, because there's like a lot of Sophocles. And you have 3 plays: Antigone, the Oedipus the King, Oedipus at Colonus. So far, so good. Anything suspicious about the way in which this book is put together? Yes?
It was edited.
It was edited by this guy David Green and Richard Lattimore. Why is that suspicious?
Because it's not technically the original. Like, you can only truly understand it in its original format.
Ah, yes.
And under that it says third edition edited by other people.
Excellent. So it's doubly suspicious. I see a hand. Is that possible? Yes?
And these people also all didn't live at the same time.
Excellent. So, and which people didn't live at the same time? Just out of curiosity.
Sophocles and the editors.
Sophocles and the editors. If I had my timeline back, the editors would be way, way over here. Sophocles is way, way back here, right? So what do you make of this? Are we just like lying to you all the time? Maybe. So to just kind of take a step back, sorry, I'm just going to be like very pedantic for a moment. If you really want to know when this book is written, you have to go to the table, the title page, right? And in the title page, we notice something else really suspicious. What is the copyright year for Antigone? You have 1942, 1954. Super suspicious. So far, so good. We're all lying to you. So what do we have to do to get back to the Oedipus the King or the Antigone?
Learn ancient Greek.
Learn ancient Greek. You've learned very well. So we have this book. Here's some ancient Greek. How are we doing? Great. You guys will like enroll in Greek 101 in the fall. Does this book look suspicious to you too? If we're trying to get back, yes.
There's a lot of editor's notes in the bottom.
There's a ton of editor's notes in the bottom. Just as a footnote, I love these editor's notes. They're very, very good, but you should be super, super suspicious, yes?
It's also on like bright white paper.
It's on bright white paper, which looks suspiciously well preserved, yes?
It's both in lowercase and it has accent marks.
Yes, you know a lot about ancient Greek, I think. You should come see me. If you don't know a lot about ancient Greek, we will talk about what all those are. This text should also be suspicious, right? So one of the kind of extraordinary things is I've shown you 2 editions of Sophocles' Antigone. The first one is an edition which Bart College has said the edition you will read in L&T, very authoritative, multiple editors, very scholarly, published by the University of Chicago Press. How much better could you get? The next, this is actually published by Oxford. I guess maybe that's a little better. But nonetheless, what we're dealing with is this essentially a modern construction of a very, very old opera. And so what I kind of just want to sort of emphasize for this moment is that if you guys go to a bookstore, if you go to the Bard bookstore, if you go to an enormous Barnes & Noble bookstore, if you go to Amazon, you cannot buy the original of Sophocles. It is impossible. And not only that, but these editorial marks here tell you that we don't even really have 100% consensus on what that original was. There are passages you can see that in fact will, so if you see that 5 on the right, this is getting very technical. Do you see above that how there are these 2 crosses? Do you see all those crosses? That means that everyone who has studied classics for the last 2,000 years cannot agree on what that should say. In the 4th line of the Antigone, we cannot agree on what it should say. Because this means something that is not without ate, which is sort of violence and suffering, which makes no sense in the context. When you guys read your edition, you will just blithely read by it. Your editors will have smoothed it all over. They won't have told you there is any problem at all. But they are lying to you. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean for this to become such like a condemnation of the world of scholarship. But it's about sort of showing you what history has to offer. So in the case of Antigone, there's like one other problem. So do you guys know roughly like what genre would you say the Antigone is in? Does that make sense? Like how would you describe the Antigone? What would be the word you'd use to describe this work? Yes.
Tragedy.
A tragedy? And what is a tragedy? That's a really sad thing, but like if you were to kind of experience a tragedy, yeah.
A play.
A tragedy is also a play,
Where someone dies.
where usually someone dies, yes.
It should invoke catharsis.
It should invoke catharsis. Aristotle says that. Aristotle and I have a disagreement, but that's okay. We will talk, you guys will talk about catharsis. You will probably love catharsis, but yes. So, just to get a little like step here, so this is a book that has Greek words. This is a book that has English words. Are these plays in the way that you come to experience plays? We're missing something, right? So the Antigone is even more complicated because the original performance of the Antigone looked like this. Not really, that's another joke. This is actually a Bard senior thesis or senior project, which was a translation of the Antigone and a performance of it at a place called Opus 40 across the river, which was created by like a Bard professor. The person way in the background, sorry, this slide is not as visible as I thought it would be, is a professor of religion, Bruce Chilton. Another person is like a senior or will be a senior this year. But this is actually what is being translated onto this page, if that makes sense. So far, so good. I've like hopefully sort of shattered your expectations. How are you guys doing? You're like surviving. Okay. I'm just trying to like make your life a little bit exciting. So, if we're going to try to go backwards to get to Sophocles, we have a few things that we can do, and I'm just going to take you through like a little bit of sort of like histories of like what old books look like. I sort of like let the cat out of the bag, but it may just be sort of interesting to think about these. So this book here is a really famous book. It's actually a very old book. No one recognizes this? Did someone say Gutenberg? What is the Gutenberg Bible? Does anyone know like what makes it sort of special? Has heard about it? You're nodding.
Gutenberg. This was the first like widely accessible translation of the Bible.
And it was widely accessible for a very specific reason.
Because of the printing press.
Because of the printing press. You guys, I think, probably live in a world of digital technology even more than I did, and so maybe the printing press doesn't seem that amazing. But let me tell you, the printing press was pretty amazing. So the Gutenberg Bible, this is 1455. This is the first time that someone could actually reproduce pages by just like smooshing down a letter, if that makes sense. In order to reproduce pages before, you had to write them by hand. This is a copy of the Quran from, I believe, the 7th century CE. And what you can see, so I've sort of like tried to use all the old books that you have at OMT to illustrate this, if that makes sense. You can see that someone actually physically wrote this book out by hand. If you think about the length of any of these books, that is, say, the Antigone, the Bible, or the Quran, it begins to give you a sense of like the time scale that's involved. I see some of you guys with notebooks, right? You will probably fill up those notebooks in the course of the 3 weeks in L&T. What you write in those notebooks might be like a quarter of the Bible or the Quran. And so the process of kind of like copying books is incredibly labor intensive. And until 1455, every single book that was in existence had to have been copied by hand by a person. Just to sort of like put that in, like a person, maybe multiple people, had to physically write by hand every book that we have from 1455. Which just gives you a sense of the sort of extraordinary labor. And I have here just like a sort of image. You might, can you sort of make out what's going on there? Can someone tell me what they see? Yes?
The books are chained to them.
The books are chained, excellent. Wow.
So I'm guessing some people can't steal them.
So people cannot steal them? If you go into the Bard library, there are no chains on the books. All you have to do is hand over your Bard ID, they give you the book, and you can keep it for a long time. And I don't even think they have library funds anymore. Just to give you a context. Part of the reason the book is chained is it's like that valuable as an object. Like if someone took a book away from the library, you couldn't like just go to Amazon and buy a new one. This is like the labor of months for someone in order to make these books. So I might just sort of like take a little breather here and just kind of sort of like switch to a kind of another sort of section of like what I want to talk to you guys about. Are there any questions you have? Any things you want to talk more about? Any like pleas for mercy? Sorry, that's a joke. Yes.
What were libraries like 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago?
That is a fantastic question. I should have brought a slide. So one thing actually is that ancient Greek papyri look more like this. They're round, they're rolls often rather than the kind of codex format, if that makes sense. I did actually bring a physical book, which was like very stupid of me. But if you think about a book that opens up, right, like so your notebook, and it sort of like flips page to page, the ways that papyri were originally written, which we'll talk about in a moment, are these kind of round scrolls, which were sort of circular. So rather than having shells, they had kind of boxes. The most famous library was in the city of Alexandria in Egypt, which was about 2,300 years ago. And the general story is that if you sailed to Alexandria, which was like a super big port in that period, every book on your ship would be confiscated by the library. And they claimed it would quickly be copied by their scribes, but according to some accounts, they would copy it and give you the copy back and keep the original. Because the other thing, of course, that happens is that when someone copies a book, they make mistakes, as you will discover later. This is an excellent question. So libraries were not so much for borrowing, but there were these sort of repositories for books. And the word for library was often the word for treasure chest, if that makes sense.
I'm sorry, often the word for what?
Treasure chest. Like a bibliotheca is a place that you put books, but you could also call it the thesauron, which is the treasure chest. It's where you get the word for thesaurus, actually. Sorry, this is like a talk on all of it. Anything else you guys want to know about like the history of books, which is just to get us warmed up? Nothing. Excellent. Okay. So
There's
let's.
a question here.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
I was just wondering, like, how would the papyrus work? Like, how would you roll out the paper to read it? I guess.
So you would hold one piece in one hand and one piece in the other hand, and you would sort of turn like this.
But like, if you just a long piece of paper.
It would be a super, super long piece of paper.
Okay.
And it usually goes sort of from left to right. They're pretty big pieces of paper, like sometimes papyri are as long as like 30 feet, and therefore very heavy. And so we have an account in this letter writer called Pliny the Younger of one of his sort of idols who was reading a really big papyrus roll, and he dropped it, and he tripped, and he died because he like healed badly from falling with the papyrus roll. This is an excellent question. Excellent. Did I see you have more?
Can I ask you a follow-up? So would people sometimes have like multiple rolls to make a book almost?
Yeah, so something like the Iliad, for instance, or the Odyssey, these like huge epic poems, probably each of what we think of, they're made up of 24 books. Each of those books would probably be a papyrus roll, just to make it like a little more manageable. The other thing, which I guess is sort of worth pointing out, like if I told you in your Antigone book to open to page 25, how would you guys do that? You would just like open up the book and you'd open to page 30 and you'd go back, right? If I told you to open to column 25 on the papyrus roll, you'd have to go. And if I told you to open to page like 700, you'd go forever. Yes?
Do we know what was the most translated book back then?
The most translated book in antiquity? That is a very good question. You mean that like from one language to another?
Yeah.
Probably the Iliad and the Odyssey, I would guess. The Bible is translated in a really interesting way, actually. So have you guys heard the expression the Septuagint? Some of you maybe, but maybe not. So there's two aspects of the Bible, right? There's the kind of New Testament aspect of the Bible, and then there's the so-called Hebrew Bible or the Jewish Bible. In order to turn Hebrew into Greek, the story goes that 70 translators simultaneously translated the Hebrew books of the Bible. And according to the story, they created like an identical version of the Hebrew Bible, which then became a sacred text. And the justification for this is that translation in this sort of model is never perfect, right? As we just said, it always involves interpretation. And so if a translation is identical across 70 people, it had to be divinely inspired and therefore perfect. But when dealing with a sacred book like the Bible, translation becomes extraordinarily fraught, if that makes sense. So that's not exactly the question you asked, but it sort of raises an important point. Like if you get something wrong in the Iliad and the Odyssey are amazing books. I love them. We will teach courses in the Iliad and the Odyssey. You should take them all. But if we get like something wrong in the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's not like we've ruined the sort of structure of our religious beliefs, if that makes sense. If you have a book that is sacred and you are translating a sacred book, you better be very, very careful. And this is sort of what that story suggests. Likewise, in the sort of like Renaissance and after the Renaissance, the learning of Greek, Hebrew, and Latin was often highly regulated precisely because the church did not want people to read the Bible on their own and come to their own interpretations. Just other kind of questions? Yes?
I see that there's still columns, like pages.
Yes.
I was wondering if there was any moment when somebody decided kind of to standardize the width of those columns, or how did they measure what's the proper length or width for these columns?
So there are like planning guides in Papyri you sometimes see, like people would write out, you know, like they would make these little guidelines. Different papyri have different column widths actually. And so there's a very excellent and technical scholar at Duke University who measured the column widths of all the papyri from a particular city that I'm going to talk about in a moment and wrote a book about them. And they fall into a variety of groups. This is like a super, super technical work. I'm really glad this person did this. I could not for the life of me write a book about this, but this person did this. So there is some kind of regularity, but it's not necessarily the case that they'd all be the same size, and presumably a bigger book would cost more. And there are some copies that we'll look at in a second that might be more expensive than others. Yes, I see now lots of hands. Way in the back, and then we'll go there.
Okay, the question I had was, how do you get access, or what's the process to edit an original book if the original author is dead?
That is a really, really good question. So I won't actually be able to show you, I think, very many original compositions. One of the sort of extraordinary things is that even the oldest copies that survive are often like very new compared to the author. But getting papyri is like really, really tricky. And I may talk about it at the end if that's okay. That's like a fantastic question, and it's like really, really interesting. And it has like a little bit of scandal, but that's okay. But this is, yeah, it turns out not to be very fair. That's the short answer. So I think I saw you and then you, if that's okay.
Did we lose as much like information, knowledge, potentially progress in the Library of Alexandria as like these colonies?
Yes. So the question is like, how much information did we lose in the destruction of the Library of Alexandria? I'm not sure that the Library of Alexandria alone was a sort of like the single moment that destroyed so much knowledge. But estimates basically are that we have like something like 1% of the material from antiquity. And the reason that it survives is like always very perplexing. Some things survive because people really cared about them. Like the Bible, for instance, survived because so many people thought it was such an important book. But there's a lot of books that survive that really just survive by chance. And it's sort of a sobering thought. And the picture we have of antiquity is really skewed for that reason. Yes?
I know that like in a synagogue, they'll have like the Torah scroll like rolled up, and it's like a huge, massive scroll, and like there's a whole process to like making it. So I was wondering about like if there's a certain importance to having scrolls in certain religions, and also like when did we make the transition from scrolls to like actual books?
These are fantastic questions. So the codex, which I call them codex, just as a brief footnote, I just have to like take a dig at modern technology. Your iPhones have gone back to scrolling, or your Android phones, or your laptop. That scrolling has never stopped. It just has become like the mode in which people read. The codex, that is to say the book that opens, was invented sometime in the 1st century CE, so between like 0 and 100. Originally, it was thought that the codex was made for Christian texts because it seemed to arise at the same time as Christianity, and because the liturgies often have kind of what you might describe as like random access, right? Like you would read one liturgy one day and another the other day, and they wouldn't necessarily be in order. And so for a really long time, people thought that that was the case. But it actually turns out that that's probably not true, and all kinds of books are written on codices, which is the plural of codex. One of the most amazing is this like really salacious Greek novel called Lonely Eunice's Phoenician Affairs, which was discovered by the person who taught me when I was a graduate student. He was like a young person who had just finished his PhD, and he received this like papyrus codex to edit. And he opened the codex and he began to read it, and basically it was a scene of human sacrifice in which a group of bandits ate the heart of a young boy and then engaged in like an orgy. And this was a codex. And so just to give you a sense of like the kind of like curiosity and the sort of strangeness of it, like this is not sort of reserved for any particular religion. And so the Torah scrolls I think are ancient, and there's like a reason for that. But I think in general, those are kind of specific cases rather than sort of like one format is for one thing and one format is for another. That's like an excellent, excellent question. Yes?
In terms of the preservation of stories, in many cultures there's an emphasis on oral stories.
Yes.
Has there ever been an instance, or like, is it common to find like the original text that an oral story comes from and be able to compare like the modern day like story that's been passed down as opposed to the original text?
So this is super fascinating. So the term oral story is really, really interesting, right? So one way of thinking of an oral story is a story that you tell in sort of like aloud. And in some ways, like I didn't bring a script because I wasn't going to read a lecture to you, but I sort of made notes to myself and I sort of decided like what I would say. And so if you went to my house and you found my notes, you could compare what I said to you to my notes, and in fact it's like quite different, so it's good I didn't read. Another type of oral story is actually not one that starts in writing, but one that starts in speaking. And people often sort of like try to distinguish those two a little bit, and so some stories don't actually have, in a true sense, like an original, if that makes sense. Like if you think about like a fairy tale, right? Like a fairy tale has a kind of form of that story, and the brothers Grimm, who were these sort of German scholars, actually collected them and tried to figure out the original one. But in fact, if you were to like go through the world, you would actually find that there are all kinds of different variations on a fairy tale, and that those stories are sort of different. So what you're asking is like a super fascinating question. Like there are some stories that kind of resist being text. And when they become text, what's actually captured is just like a single version of that story, or a particular version of that story. This is especially true of the Iliad and the Odyssey. This is like a pretty controversial position sometimes. I got yelled at by someone for saying that the Iliad and the Odyssey were oral, but in a way they are oral. Like they originated in oral storytelling, whatever the form it is that you have. There may be, I don't want to sort of like stir too much, but there's sort of like some good arguments to think about like the beginning of the Bible, for instance in Genesis, as having some of the patterns of oral storytelling that were then captured on the page. I know that Genesis is probably not like on the top of your reading list at the moment, but Genesis actually has two contradictory accounts of the creation of the earth. And those kind of coexistence of two contradictory accounts might be a sign that this was like once an oral story rather than like a written. Does that help a little bit? Sorry, you've asked like a question that would like be a whole class. You guys in fact all ask questions that would be whole classes. Anything else you want to ask? Sorry.
So you will be reading Genesis, including those two stories.
Excellent. So when you read those stories, think about how those two stories could have come into existence. That's all I'll say. I don't want to steal anything. It's very exciting. It's amazing. Yes?
Is there a library that's like famous for keeping all these old books and vintage, and can you access it?
So the great thing, and then I'll show you some old books. The great thing about old books is that they are actually out of copyright. So the translation that you guys are reading has a copyright, but you can go on the internet to a website called Perseus, and you can read every text in Greek and Latin basically for free on your laptop, or your iPhone, or your Android phone, or whatever. And it's like an amazing, amazing thing. There are translations there that are old and they're just out of copyright. The physical copies of books, which was also your question, which we'll get to in just a second, are like a little bit more complicated because there's not that many of them, and it turns out they're like super, super, super fraught about who gets to look at them and who doesn't. If that makes sense. Any other pressing questions before I show you some papyrus?
So would you say that the Vatican has the largest collection in the world at this point, or is there another that has a larger?
It depends on what period you want. So the Vatican has an incredible collection of what are medieval manuscripts, which are basically from the period that is like my dark period, as it were, so like after 400 but before 1455. Other places in Europe where they were copied tend to have like really, really good collections. The monastery on Mount Athos has like an insane collection of Greek materials. What I'm interested in are these things called papyri, which are even older, and the Vatican does not have that many papyri. And in part it doesn't have papyri because the papyri really challenged the narrative of temporality that they want. And let me show you like a little bit of a papyrus, unless there's like a burning question. Though I will like give you more time to ask questions, but I sort of just want to show you this. So this is, after all of that, this is like what I am like most obsessed by, as it were, in my like own scholarly life. So this, you can see, is not bright white like my sort of example of the Antigone before. It's, what else can you see? What do you notice? I wonder if I can make the light different, or can you guys see okay? You can see roughly okay. So what do you notice about this? You probably notice that I'm like a total wacko because I'm like really obsessed by this thing that is like really broken.
There's like fibers and like
Yeah, so it has all these fibers that you can see that are coming out. Excellent. What else?
No spaces or punctuation.
There's no spaces or punctuation. This is like very precise. Excellent. What else? You have no idea what's going on? And why don't you know what's going on?
It's in shambles.
It is in shambles! Thank you. Sorry, everyone was too polite to tell me that I've just shown you this horrible, tattered document that was in shambles. If you guys had read the Antigone, I would try to quiz you. This is actually from the chorus of the Antigone. As you read the first chorus of the Antigone, I believe it is lines 109 to 123, think of this papyrus and think whether you would have recognized them. I'm not doing well, I think, with selling you guys on costumes. I better than that. So one of the kind of crazy things, right, is that if you were to kind of collect the papyrus, you don't know what you have, and you just pick it up and you start reading it. So the poor sucker who got to edit this papyrus was like so excited, and someone said, you know, come over here, we have something for you to look at. And they dutifully transcribed the letters, and they looked at it really carefully, and they're like, oh, it's just another copy of the Antigone. But one of the sort of things that's amazing is that this is probably about from the 2nd century CE. This is an 1800-year-old copy of the Antigone. This is one of the oldest copies of the Antigone that we have. And in fact, we don't have a lot of papyri of the Antigone. I looked in preparation for this lecture. Most of the papyri we have come from this time period. So this is like one of the oldest copies of the Antigone that we have. The reason that we have the full Antigone is because between 200 CE and today, a bunch of people sort of carefully copied the Antigone and preserved it. But there's some other things that we have that are better preserved. So you guys can see this. How does this compare to the other one? Don't worry too much about the writing, but just, what do you notice?
It's bigger.
It's bigger. There's a lot of it. You can see different columns. The columns are really, really wide, right? This turns out to be an extraordinary discovery, which is it's a play by Sophocles that we otherwise do not have, which is called The Trappers. It's a so-called satyr play. Those people who have the kind of like beards that you can sort of see on the slide, those are the satyrs. And I'll just read to you some of the chorus of The Trappers, just to give you a sense of like what this like represents. So the slide says, come here, see if you can find the footprints of the lost pebble. Up-a-pie! Oh, listen, I tell you, get the thief underground, finish the job. My old father, how can we find out the secret thefts in the night? If I did meet free life for my father, so may the dear God bring an end to my labors, as he has shown us the extraordinary excellence of his gold. What do you guys think of that? You're smiling when you're not.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's fun.
You think it's fun? Excellent. This is great. What makes it fun?
Just like thinking about them like tracking down the like, or yeah, the thefts and the fact that they're like satyrs, I think this was fun.
So if we go back to the slide, right, we imagine these satyrs, right, who are like followers of the god Dionysus, who happen to be the god of wine, ecstasy, and tragedy. And you imagine all of them in a chorus, sort of chasing around looking for the cow, right? So it's sort of fun. Does this sound to you like what you've come to expect from tragedy? Did I see a hand up? You and someone said they really wanted catharsis and dead bodies. Does this seem likely to produce catharsis or dead bodies? No. So this is like a very different type of tragedy, right? Like this is actually called a satyr play. We only had one other kind of satyr play example, and the papyri give us this sort of like really quite fun, sort of ridiculous scene. Yes?
Is this the same thing with the Bacchae is?
The Bacchae has Dionysus, but the Bacchae ends in a like terrible murder. And the satyr play does not end in a terrible murder. So it's not like unrelated, like both are about the god Dionysus, but this one is actually about like a bunch of the followers of Dionysus just like looking for the cow. And it presumably has a pretty happy ending. We don't quite have an ending. But that's like a fantastic sort of connection. Like this is not so unbelievable that someone might think that we just like made it up. But on the other hand, this thing that has come to us is like so different from the Antigone and from the Oedipus King. Yes?
How do we know this is Sophocles?
I believe there's what's called a colophon, which says that it's like of Sophocles. This is like an excellent question.
Please explain a colophon.
Yes. So a colophon is basically it's like a title page, but it comes at the end. And it says like the Trachiniae, which is the trackers of Sophocles. The Ignutiae, which is the trackers of Sophocles. This was one of the very first papyri that were published, actually. This was like one of the sort of stunning revelations of the discovery of papyri that we had. And it was sort of there basically to say, like, look, this thing that we've started to do is actually really quite extraordinary. Anything else? I might just tell you a little bit about how we get papyri, which sort of gets to your question, and then I'll show you a few more. So these kind of like patterned papyri, sorry, there's more of it, but I don't think we need to read all of this. It's less exciting. So this looks like it's been not super well treated, right? If you return the book to the Bard Library this way, you might get like an email from them asking you like what happened to the book. Does that? And if we did this with the other one, you would definitely get that email. So let me give you like a little brief discussion of like how we get papyrus, if that makes sense. So papyrus is a plant. And in fact, like if you look at the sort of behind the campus center, there's that little parking lot, and there's those sort of like plants that come up. And the last time I was there, I'm pretty sure they're papyrus plants. Like it grows, it's like very sort of like nice for like watery areas. But the plant itself is not what you write on, but it's processed to make a kind of paper. And you can in fact buy kits to make papyrus, which I did, and I tried to make papyrus, so I'll show you a little bit like how that happened. So you get these like long, thin strips of papyrus, and then you sort of like wet them in a dish to soak them, if that makes sense. So far, so good. Then you arrange them perpendicularly, and you smush them, and the sort of like natural kind of like glue is supposed to hold them together, and then you press them, and then that's what I got. Which means that my job as like a papyrus maker is not particularly sort of like secure. But this is maybe more what you would expect to get. So you get the sort of like horizontal, the perpendicular fibers, which are put together. This, in the Mediterranean, was like the primary writing material that was used for books in the ancient world. And as far as we know, papyrus was used pretty much everywhere. We know papyrus in Greece, we know papyrus in Italy, we know papyrus in Egypt, and we actually know papyrus in the Black Sea region. I recently saw a paper of someone who, in what is like basically Crimea, found a papyrus, which was done before, like when in fact you could travel to the Crimea. So there's like a whole range of places that people use papyrus. But if you guys have ever taken a piece of paper and you've left it outside, what happens with that piece of paper? It like disintegrates, right? If you like spill water on your paper, it disintegrates. And so for paper to last for a very long time requires very, very specific conditions. One specific set of conditions was the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. If in the Bay of Naples, this is like a very close-up shot, so if you think about Italy, right, which is that like long stiletto, and if you think in the middle of the shin, there's the city of Naples, and in the city of Naples in 79 CE, a volcano erupted suddenly and incinerated everything. You would think this would be really bad, and if you were a human being who lived in Pompeii, it was terrible. But if you were a papyrus, it was really fortunate. And so it produced, you can see on the top, these like carbonized blobs of papyrus, which were just like instantly incinerated by volcanic gases. And by virtue of their instant incineration, people were able to unroll them. And so there's like a whole series of like really complicated unrolling machines that had to have like really, really gentle tension so that they could gradually pull apart these like really fragile documents. And then they hired these expert and fast draftspeople who would come and they would like draw what they saw on the papyrus, because the papyrus would disintegrate almost immediately. It was a sort of like extraordinary process. You would think that what this would yield would be like new plays of Sophocles, new amazing books of the Iliad, new Greek novels, all kinds of extraordinary literature. But in fact, what we got was a philosopher who was kind of boring. There's a whole school of papyrology devoted to these papyri of this philosopher called Philodemus, who was like a second-rate Epicurean. It's really sad. Sorry. If you love Philodemus, that's, I'm sorry. There's another library in this person's house, so there's this person who just loved Philodemus and like bought everything that Philodemus ever wrote and just happened to have the best library in Naples, and it happened to be incinerated. There's another one that's underwater. People are desperately trying to get the stuff out of there. My bet is you're not going to get anything very exciting because this guy has like terrible taste, but you never know. So that's one way. Are you raising your hand, or you're contemplating unrolling the papyrus? Sorry. Anyway, sorry. I accidentally call on people in class. It just happens.
Me, I'm just rolling.
Sorry. Anyway, yeah, that's my problem. So one possibility is you could burn the papyrus, but a much better possibility is to look in Egypt. And the reason to look in Egypt is twofold. And this image, I will tell you about in a moment, like why I've chosen this image. One reason to look in Egypt is that Egypt has this like incredibly long history, and we have papyri from Egypt that are literally 4,000 years old, before the Greeks and Romans even like contemplated speaking Greek or Latin. But another reason is that Egypt is a desert, and it's really dry, and stuff really survives. And a third reason is that not only did Egypt have home to Egyptian texts, it was also home to a bunch of people who spoke Greek and a smaller number of people who spoke Latin because of Alexander the Great. And so this is an image of the tomb of Ramses VI, who was a pharaoh who died in about 1200 BCE, so about 3,200 years ago. And if you look really carefully, you can see this is, does anyone recognize who that sort of god is? And not quite Seth, not quite Ra, the falcon god, Horus. I tried, sorry. I didn't mean to give you guys a pop quiz, but so this is the falcon god Horus. And one of the amazing things, you can sort of see there's like some writing around it, which looks a little bit like our letters, right? You can see like an NE. And so in this tomb of Ramses VI, which is 3,200 years old, in antiquity it was opened, and Greeks went to the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. They went into the tombs of Ramses VI and they wrote graffiti. And one of the things that they wrote on their graffiti, which you can almost make out, is that Horus, who is identified in Greek as Apollo, they wrote, you can see that big A. You guys see the big A? You can see the P, that looks like a pie. You can see an O, these things that look like sort of tents, right? LL. And then an omega and a nu. They wrote Apollo. So the Greeks went into this tomb and they wrote graffiti on Ramses VI's tomb in which they said like Horus was Apollo. And this kind of like moment of kind of cultural sort of interaction produced many, many of the papyri that we have. And the sort of the best place to get papyri if you speak English is this city called Oxyrhynchus, which is like a little bit down here, where two people from Oxford who are graduate students decided to go digging at the end of the 19th century. You can sort of see these are like very, very old photos. And you might notice that the people who are digging are not Oxford graduate students, but in fact Egyptians that they hired. And thus begins like a sort of third point of this question, which is that if papyri exists in Egypt, and most of the people who study papyri or have studied papyri until quite recently were in Europe and the United States, how do we deal with this imbalance? And so we're sort of about to kind of like shift a little bit to this kind of question about who gets access to antiquity. We have another figure. This is Grenfell and Hunt. These were the people who like sort of organized the expedition. You can see they have like a very nice tent. It does not look like they've done a lot of digging. This kind of question about like what to do with papyri, I think is like a really sort of profound question, and I sort of want to use this last few minutes to sort of show you both like some of the stuff we can uncover, and also talk a little bit about some of the sort of pitfalls of using this evidence or collecting this evidence. And then I'll give you time to ask more questions. Sorry, I feel like I've been talking a lot to you. One is that you not only do you get new texts like the trappers, not only do you get copies of Sophocles and Antigone, but you also get these incredible testaments of people's lives. So this is a papyrus letter, which otherwise we wouldn't know. So this guy called Theon, which is a Greek name, writes to his father Theon, and he says, if you don't send for me, I won't eat, I won't drink, so then. If you guys want to go home from guard, I don't know whether I'd recommend writing this to any parents or not, but. So we get these extraordinary sort of documents. Like this is just sort of a silly one, but we get tax receipts. We get like a sense of like how Egypt worked in this period. We also get things like this. So what do you see here?
You see the combination of writing and also pictures.
You see the combination of writing and pictures? Excellent. How did you sort of like evaluate the pictures?
They're in color.
They're in color?
Yeah.
They may look a little crude to some of you. Maybe not. Okay. If not, that's excellent. I'm just trying to sell you on the pictures. Let me give you another set of pictures that might be a little easier to sort of interpret. So this is supposed to be the labors of Hercules. What do you think you see maybe in the upper right? Can someone tell me what's going on there?
Is that the lion?
It looks like a lion, and what's happening with the lion? It looks like Hercules is fighting and wrestling the lion. Down here, it's a little hard to see because of the way the lights are going. Hercules is wrestling something which looks a little bit more small. It seems likely that on the top he's wrestling a lion, on the bottom he's wrestling a chameleon. So it's kind of a joke, but it's this sort of extraordinary joke that we wouldn't otherwise have. So one thing that papyri allow us to do, which I think is like really amazing, is they allow us to see a world that is so much richer than the world of like the Vatican Library's medieval manuscripts. They allow us to see as a world that is like, you can see people writing letters to their parents. You can see this kind of like ancient comic strip. You can see this papyrus with these like figures who are like litigating a court case. You can read about people who attest to like really extraordinary sort of experiences. We have judicial records of people who say like, you know, my neighbor hit me with a stick because I stopped him from stealing figs. And so this way of understanding the ancient world is so much richer and so much more interesting by virtue of the papyrus. Was your hand up or yours just being okay? And in fact, if we sort of took away all of the medieval manuscripts and we had papyri, we'd have like a really exciting, and just what we have in papyri, we'd have a so much more exciting world. But I think we also have to understand that getting papyri is like not super straightforward. And so one way that it's not super straightforward is that getting papyri very frequently involves excavating in Egypt, and it involves people excavating in Egypt who are not always Egyptians. Until 1974, it was legal to export material from Egypt. After 1974, it is not. And so any excavations that are done now, all the material has to remain in Egypt. But papyri were like big money. Yes?
I do have a question. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but it's about literacy.
Yes.
And it's related to literacy in the past, like in the time of
Yes.
the papyri.
And this, I think, is like a really important question, because in a way, the kind of, the virtue of papyri, right? Like the virtue of having these sort of like attestations of the ancient world, which are extraordinary, is that they allow us to kind of get a picture of the world that is much less kind of rarefied. But in order to get them paradoxically, you have to do tons of specialist training. And so one of the weird things from the modern perspective is that reading papyri is like the province of people with PhDs, or people who took Greek in the fall. But on the other hand, it attests to a world which I think looks much more like a world that you would recognize as a world that is not just a world of like high forbidding ideas, but is an exciting, vibrant world full of people who are like living real lives, right? And the kind of trying to sort of demystify the ancient world actually requires a lot of expertise. And this is like a really complicated paradox in modernity. The flip side of this is antiquity, which is that the number of people who could read and write in antiquity is not huge. I can't actually tell you the percentages, but it's not huge at all. And so the testimony that we get from papyri is still elite testimony, if that makes sense. We're still in this sort of like world. Yes?
Yeah, if Oxyrhynchus was a trash dump, why would he been thrown away?
I'm sorry?
If Oxyrhynchus is a trash dump, why were these thrown in there?
Probably because it wore out. I mean, that's my like best explanation, right? Like this does not look like a papyrus that is in like great shape. When you guys wear out your books, you either like give them away to people or you sort of toss them. And that seems to be the only explanation. Yeah.
Do you think that it's ultimately important to allow like these countries that have been like colonized and so on, like clearly Egypt does not have access to a lot of its own artifacts, to be like the ultimate arbiters of like documents like these ones, even if that means ultimately like losing our memory or losing out on knowledge?
I mean, this is the sort of central question. The status of the world as it is that what has been exported since 1974 exists in libraries primarily in Europe. There's a papyrus collection in Michigan, but that's really, and there's one in Berkeley, but those are the main ones in the US. And then there are also papyri that exist and are in Egypt. And some of those papyri have been recently excavated. Some of them are in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Some are on display, some are not on display. Some have been read and made public, and some have not. And I think this is like a really sort of complicated question to balance, because on the one hand, it seems unlikely that people will give back objects that they do not have to give back legally. And we'll talk about that in a second. On the other hand, it also seems that there's some kind of human good in reading what's on the papyri, and sort of balancing claims to who physically has copies versus who has sort of like the expertise and interest in like making them public is like a really sort of central question. And so I'm actually not answering your question, but it's like a very hard question to answer. It gets harder. And I think I will sort of just like show you like a few sort of news stories. So this is now a few years ago, but do you guys remember hearing about like a Sappho discovery? Yes, I hear some nodding. So this headline, sorry, I don't know why, but Google like popped up as I took my screenshot this one. So the headline should say like a new Sappho poem is more exciting than a new David Bowie album. If you're not David Bowie fans, you can just like substitute like any artist. This article is from January 30th, 2014, when the new papyrus, or the quote-unquote new papyrus came out. Does anyone who remembers it, can they give me like a little bit of a sense of like what happened? Maybe not. Okay. So in 2014, this scholar in Oxford, who was called Dirk Ovid, accidentally told the world, or maybe accidentally told the world, that he discovered a new poem of Sappho. Do you guys know who Sappho is? I love Sappho. Someone tell me who Sappho is. Yes?
She's a Greek poet that wrote a lot of lyric poetry, but we don't have like all of her poems, obviously, because a lot of them got destroyed.
And she doesn't survive the way that Sophocles does. We don't have medieval manuscripts of Sappho. We're almost entirely dependent upon papyri. And fragments. Anne Carson, who is like a kind of genius, made a sort of like beautiful collection of Sappho's fragments. So this is like one poem we have on Sappho. Does someone want to read that for me? Just don't worry about the brackets. If you read the brackets, you're like in person. If you don't read the brackets, you're also allowed not to. Can I get like a volunteer to read it? It won't make any sense. And in person like really compound words.
Beautiful gifts, children. Song delighting, clear sounding lyre. All my skin, old age already. Hair turned white after black. Knees do not carry like fawns, but what could I do? Not possible to become dawn with arms of roses, bringing to the ends of the earth, yet seized. What?
Excellent. What do you guys make of that? Reactions? Like any reactions at all? No reactions.
Dawn with the Arms of Roses is a kick-ass line.
Dawn with the Arms of Roses is a kick-ass line, if I can say that. Yes. I accept all compliments of Sappho. Other reactions? Any reaction is a good reaction.
So a literal translation from the Greek rather than any interpretation that might include, not sure if any of those are idioms from.
I mean, so Carson has made a kind of like business of like making Greek seem like Greek, if that makes sense. Like that's part of like what Carson is doing as a translator. Yeah, you're gonna say something.
It seems like she's reflecting on old age and love his old experience with that.
So on the one hand, we have Carson's like super literal, but also super poetic translation. On the other hand, we have the she, which is Sappho, who appears to be reflecting on old age. Excellent. What else do you notice? Yeah.
Only one line.
Oh, the sort of little bracket, right, which tells us that we're missing something. So we get a sense of sort of how kind of like fragmentary it is. What do you, if I asked you to like rate this, where would you guys rate this poem, if you like it or not like it? Yes.
One of my reactions is like, it kind of feels like a poem you might hear like a really smart fifth grader write in a way.
That's fair.
Yeah. So.
It's a little bit like that sort of film, right, of like a really smart elementary school student whose teacher like plagiarizes their poems. It's called like The Kindergarten Teacher. You guys have not seen that film. It's on Netflix somewhere. Okay, never mind. I tried. So there's something of that, right? This is when it actually is more complete. Does someone want to read the more complete version? Do you want to read the more complete version if you read the first version?
Sure. You, children, be zealous with the beautiful gifts of the violet-lapped muses, and with the clear, song-loving lyre. But my skin, once soft, is now taken by old age. My hair turns white from black. And my heart is weighted down, and my knees do not lift, that once were light to dance as fawns. I groan for this. But what can I do? A human being without old age is not a possibility. There is the story of Tithonus, loved by dawn and her arms of roses, and she carried him off to the ends of the earth when he was beautiful and young. Even so was he gripped by white old age. He still has his deathless wife.
Excellent. How does this seem as a full poem? You guys like it more? I saw your hand.
Yeah, I'm remembering the last two lines in the previous poem where it says, yet seized wife. I think the last two lines in this poem make a lot more sense.
So it makes a huge amount more sense. Yes? Go ahead.
I think the last poem had a very simple eloquence to it. Like it was written like how the Finland would write, but I think in a way that like is beautiful. But this is also wonderful too.
It's more what?
This is wonderful too. I just wanted to say that.
No. So, like, in a way, right, the two are like super, super different. The kind of like complete completion of this is on the one hand sort of like tempting, on the other hand, like you might find a kind of elegance in the sort of fragmentary nature. Yeah. I saw that in back there. Yes.
So I know that like a lot of times the translations of Sappho are made out to be either she was writing about a friend, or that or the gender of the, I guess, the person who she's addressing with the poem is changed to be male. Is this one of those occasions? I know it talks about Mykonos, and I'm not quite sure who that is.
So, this is not, so for instance, fragment 1 is addressed to like a female interlocutor, or is addressed, so like it's definitely a sort of like relationship that's not Tithonus, just so you know, actually, the story of Tithonus that she's alluding to is that Tithonus basically is given immortality, but not immortal youth, and he gets really old. And so it's sort of a tragic poem about like forgetting past with us. And so this is like a mythological poem. I haven't given you a poem in which like Sappho herself is talking about a relationship, although interestingly, like this is also about a relationship, it's just not one that she's engaged in. This is also by Anne Carson, I should say. That we'll talk a little bit about like what happened in the moment.
I was just going to say that the first version seems much more like up for interpretation because there is less that's said. And so now that we have a whole poem, and you have to you don't have to, but you interpret it much more like specifically, and everybody interprets it much more similarly versus the first one.
So this is super interesting. So I put you a tiny bit on the spot, and I feel bad about this. But all of you. So the first version is what we knew before we got another papyrus. If that makes sense. I think that was implied in what I said, but just to be super, super explicit. So the version 1 was we had just like a really fragmentary papyrus. On version 2, we have more papyrus, and we get more poem. And this is part of the kind of like excitement of the Sappho papyrus, is that people really like Sappho, and they like new papyri, and you get more exciting things. Yeah.
Is this version considered like complete, or are there still potentially missing parts?
I think this is basically complete. And so this was one of the sort of really recent Sappho discoveries. Just as a footnote, Anne Carson said quite explicitly that she liked the first version she wrote better. So she was like, Anne Carson did this amazing collection of Sappho. She translated all the poems. She won a MacArthur Genius Grant. She got like every accolade you could imagine. And then between the publishing of the first poem and coming out of this poem, there was like more stuff, and she's like, oh no, I have to translate another one. And she actually liked it better when it was fragmentary. Just so for you, like the fragmentary version better, you and Anne Carson are in the same team. The papyrus that the headlines were about was yet another Sappho papyrus which came out, which I haven't given to you because it's longer, but it was also extraordinarily complete. The problem is, and this is maybe sort of like about where we'll leave it, and then I'll leave time for questions and discussions, it almost certainly was looted. And this is a Twitter thread. So Roberta Mazza works in the collection in the United Kingdom, and she's one of the sort of like champions of essentially ethical papyrology. And this is kind of like, she hasn't actually published this anywhere but on Twitter, but this seems to be almost incontrovertible. So she says this works. As we now know that these papyri were looted and the green Sappho fragments are on their way to Egypt. The green Sappho fragments refer to a collection of papyri that was purchased by the Green family, which is the family that runs the Hobby Lobby Corporation. Between the years of about 2010 and 2020, they purchased literally millions of dollars of ancient artifacts for the Museum of the Bible, which they opened in Washington, D.C. It turns out that almost all of those artifacts had been looted. And almost all of those artifacts had been looted by people who were involved in a variety of organized crime. And the Sappho papyrus that was published to huge acclaim was almost certainly one of the papyri that had been looted. As far as people can tell, the looting seems to have occurred actually during the Arab Spring. So the Arab Spring took place in Egypt at Tahrir Square, which is the sort of central square in Cairo. It's a sort of traditional place of gathering. It's also next to the Museum of Antiquities. And during that period of Egyptian revolution, it appears that people went to the Museum of Antiquities in Cairo and looted an enormous cache of papyri. They then sold those papyri on the black market, and a lot of them were purchased by this family, the Green family, in order to stock the Museum of the Bible. And so one of the things that is sort of like hovering over papyrology as a field, and as a kind of like our desire for more information and sort of more access to the past, is precisely that these objects also, in many ways, have dollar values. The Sappho papyri have been quoted as being sold or trying to be sold for something like $10 million for just like a little piece of papyrus. And the question is, how do we, as people who are interested in the past, or at least I hope interested in the past, deal with this challenge? And that's like not necessarily a question that I can answer for you immediately or easily. It seems really clear to me that we shouldn't participate in trading illegal papyri. We shouldn't participate in buying papyri. We shouldn't participate in editing papyri that have been looted. On the other hand, like the very act of studying the past, right, is one that is sort of like complicated by the very ways in which we get these documents and the very questions of access. Who gets to access these documents? How do they come into our hands? And it's like incredibly sort of difficult and challenging to sort of balance these. So I sort of just want to kind of leave you with that thought, that paradoxically, like the ways in which we get access to the past are also ways that are really complicated. And that like sort of reading papyri can have really sort of actually worrying consequences. If you look at the bottom, Roberta Mazza was in fact threatened for revealing this information. She was sort of like, people threatened to sort of like douse her in acid, which is like a really horrific, terrible thing to do. I don't think that anyone did it in a sense of like, they were there. I think it was done sort of electronically, but it's still kind of remarkable to think about. So I should sort of stop talking and leave space for you guys to ask questions or sort of share thoughts. I don't know if you have thoughts on like how we can study antiquity, how we can do it ethically, how we can study sort of parts of the world that are not at home. Yeah.
Sorry, just a clarifying question
Yes.
for myself, but is the green Sappho fragment the one that was the 2014 discovery?
Yeah, so I sort of played a small trick on you in that the 2014 discovery people don't like as much as this one. And so I didn't give that one to you. But the 2014 discovery almost certainly was purchased by the Green family. And you know that because it shares, there's another copy from the same book that the Green family purchased, which has more Sappho in it, and it has exactly the same handwriting, exactly the same line spacing. To the question about sort of the layout of columns, exactly the same column width. And this fragment, we've actually, no one other than the original editor has ever said that they've seen an original copy. But this fragment almost certainly, if it comes from the same book, it comes from the same lot of music papyri. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Maybe it's just like a wanting to have as much as possible sort of thing, but like papyrology is kind of a notorious like homophobic corporation, and the people who own it are as well. So why do they want poetry from like clear author, I guess?
So to just rephrase your question so everyone can hear, this is really fascinating, right? So the Green family's sort of stated agenda is a very kind of conservative agenda, and it's very sort of heteronormative, is probably what I'm saying. And so you said, why do they want poetry from a known queer author? And the answer is I don't know if they intended actually to buy Sappho. I think they just bought huge quantities of ancient material. And what they were really looking for were very early copies of the New Testament. And the person who published the Sappho fragment is currently in litigation with them because he claimed that he had a much earlier copy, I think, of the Gospel of Luke than he did. And he also claimed to sell it from them. But unfortunately, or he said he sold it to them, he took their money, but it belonged to a different papyrus collection, and he never delivered it. So they seem like, explicitly, they seem to want copies of the Bible. And I'm not sure why they got Sappho. In a way, it might have just been like sort of accidental. But it's a super interesting question, which is that like their very illegal purchasing has kind of given the lie to some of the ideology that they're trying to sort of show. Any other kind of thoughts or queries? Or... Yes?
Could you say a little bit more about the transmission history of the papyri of Antigone into medieval manuscripts? Do we know that history? Is that well reconstructed?
It can be a little bit. I'm just wondering if there's any chalk. So I should apologize to say that I sort of baited you guys with Antigone, and then I talked about all kinds of things that were not Antigone. The few papyri that we have from Antigone are all, and I'll just give you the image of this. They're all probably from about the 2nd century CE, and they're all written, and you can tell that basically from the handwriting. We happen to know that Sophocles produced probably on the order of at least 100 plays in his lifetime. I think that's a fair assumption, maybe more. We have 7. And the Antigone is one of those 7. The copies of the Antigone that we have probably have very little to do directly with the papyrus that I've shown. Because presumably what happened is that the Antigone was performed. The performance either came from a script that was like written in advance or sort of improvised. They were then written down in Athens, in Greece, in the 5th century BCE. Those plays continued to be copied. We know that people were reading the Antigone in the 4th century CE, the 3rd, the 2nd, the 1st, and so on and so forth, because other authors refer to the Antigone. At some point, someone decided that there would be 7 sort of school classical examples of tragedy. And those 7 school classical examples of tragedy are the copies of Sophocles that we have. We also have only 7 copies of Aeschylus. So Aeschylus is another sort of the like big 3 tragedians in Athens, and it looks very much like people were copying like 7 copies of each of the tragedians. We would have only had 7 copies of Euripides, who of the 3 tragedians is the most radical and the most revolutionary. But in an extraordinary discovery, a manuscript of Euripides containing plays that started with the letter E was discovered like in a wine jar in a monastery. And so we actually have these plays that all circle around E and I. And they are like so kind of radical and out there. You guys wanted catharsis, you wanted dead bodies, you wanted death. These plays are like sometimes called romances. They involve like Greek mythological heroines going to Egypt, going to the Black Sea, being rescued, being sent home. And so in a funny sense, like there seems to be some kind of winnowing process to answer your question, which is that like of the 100 or so plays of Sophocles that existed in antiquity, somebody or some group of people picked 7 that were really classical. And those 7 classical plays were copied like many, many times in lots and lots of manuscripts. And just to give you a sort of like sense of that, you can sort of see down here all of the kinds of like manuscript sort of attestations at the bottom. Like there's tons and tons and tons of people in the Middle Ages who copied the Antigone. The Antigone, I don't mean to say the Antigone is not a great play in any way at all. I love the kind of weird Euripidean plays, but the sort of notion that we have of a particular form of tragedy almost certainly comes partly from the fact of questions of survival. Like if you look at Euripides, because he is this sort of third tragedian, and because just by mistake we have more of him, it looks like a lot less regular than it does in the case of Sophocles. That being said, Sophocles was in antiquity was already known to be more classical than Euripides. That's a long answer. Sorry, I hope that's not, yeah.
Yeah, you said that the plays were partially composed through improvisation.
They could have been.
Potentially.
I don't think they were composed through improvisation like in the performance, but we don't know exactly how the sort of like process of writing the plays worked. We know that people, so plays had, well, I don't have to break it. So plays had 3 main actors, and then they also had a chorus. And some of this like is not easy to improvise, but it seems quite possible, right, that things might have changed in the process of performing. And so we don't really know where they came from, and we have later copies of texts of different plays on papyrus that are sort of readers' copies. So I didn't mean to like, if you're interested in improvisation, I don't have any like specific evidence, but it is, I guess the question of like where the physical copy of the play that we have comes from is not entirely clear, if that makes sense. Sorry, I feel like that's a big answer. Yeah, it sounded much more exciting in my original formulation, but that probably wasn't true. Yes?
I wanted to ask if you had any particular thoughts about, like, to paraphrase, feeling lied to by translation. Like, I guess, like, do you believe you have a lot to gain from knowing the original context or, like, the original actuality of the piece?
I mean, so I was being a little, I should be totally honest. Like, partly I'm secretly trying to persuade you. If you're interested in this, you should take Greek. But I think the second thing to say is that we shouldn't feel like, I think when you're reading a translation, it's not the case that your translator is going out and trying to trick you. If that makes sense. Like, you should not like feel, I don't want anyone in this room to feel like if you're reading a translation that you're like, that someone is pulling the wool over your eyes. On the other hand, I think that by knowing the language that you're reading a text in, you have like a lot more authority, right, to make claims about that text, and you have a lot more sort of like authority to kind of pull apart the pieces of the text. And I think that in a way, translations, especially in the case of translations that you read in classes that are carefully selected, are their own works of art, right? And so, in a way, like you're this sort of to kind of, if you're able to both read a translation and also read something in the language in which it's written, you can sort of see the active interpretation of the translation that you're doing, if that makes sense. So that's sort of my biggest plug for like learning a language that isn't English, because there really is like lots and lots and lots of things going on in a text, and a translation always has to make choices. And things are lost in translation, but they're also gained in translation. But yeah, if you want to take Greek or Latin, you should come see me. And if you want to take any other language that is not English, we teach a lot of art, and we're like ready to learn. The final thing I should say on that topic, and then probably in a minute you have to go anyway, yes, you have to go quite soon, is just to know that when you sort of are thinking about things that you might be interested in, one of the real strengths of Bard College is that there's a translation and translatability initiative, which continues and throughout the year and culminates usually every other May in a big translation studies conference. So if you're interested in any of these topics, like look out for them, they'll keep coming. And I'm super excited that you're starting to think about them. So I probably should let you return to your lives. Thank you for listening to me talk too much about Papyri, and I hope you'll think about Greek soon.